Welcome to our channel, everyone. My name is Joe Buskens. This is our family's boat shop, where over the last 50 years our family's built hundreds of fiberglass boats, done countless fiberglass repair jobs, and we built the big 29-foot hybrid bay you see there in the background. Now over the last year or two, we've been working really hard on the YouTube channel and a ton of DIY type fiberglass and Gelcoat related projects. And tonight I'm going to work specifically on a little material that you haven't seen me use a bunch in the past, but I've been getting some requests for information or my opinion on PLY. And if you're not familiar with PLY, it's kind of a unique looking material, almost looks like some kind of sheer fabric that you actually might make costume material or something out of. But it's got some interesting applications, especially when working with epoxy. And a couple of the advantages is that it's going to work with epoxy in that when you put it over it, it will produce a nice surface on there that doesn't require sanding, and it also will reduce the effects or eliminate the effects of amine blush. So if you use PLY when you're using epoxy, after you remove it, you won't have to do any sanding or amine blush removal. And those are big advantages. It also can tend to smooth out the material a little bit, and again, to reduce the amount of sanding you may have to do. So what I've got is some samples. It's gonna be a fairly short video, and I'm gonna try to buzz through this thing fairly quick. But what we're working with is just some marine grade 3/4 plywood, which is pretty standard stuff. Now, I'm gonna go over my basic prep method, and if you look here, we've got a little DeWalt high-speed grinder, and you can see that we've put some serious tooth on that plywood. That is probably one of the biggest things you can do when it comes to making your material bond properly. Plywood, as it comes from the factory, has got like a milled surface on it. It's kind of had actually one of you folks comment, said the term would be burnished. It basically lays down the grain and tightens everything up. So you can see we were using like a 24 or 36, really aggressive. Now sometimes you'll have some little loose fibers, and I'll use a little 3M sanding block with some 80 grit and kind of knock off those little burrs and radius those corners and whatnot. Now typically I like to hit that with a little bit of compressed air, again to raise that grain. And we live down here in the humid deep south. It's been kind of cloudy and overcast today. What I like to do is use a little Wagner heat gun just prior to applying my material, and I like to try to dry that surface, or just be sure that that surface is really nice and dry. So surface prep is key. You can use the best materials in the world, but if you haven't prepped the surface properly, get some good PPE rolling, always important, especially when working with epoxy to protect yourself. Now, this is going to be an abbreviated version of fiberglassing over plywood, but one of my most popular videos is how to properly fiberglass over plywood, and it's about 40 minutes long, but very, very in-depth, and it talks about laminating. And I've got one for polyester resin and another for dealing with epoxy resin. But today this is going to be a little more abbreviated. So we're using some West Systems, very popular, very commonly used epoxy. That's 3 pumps. What I like about this is you're going equal pumps, and you're going to get your ratio is going to be accurate. It's going to be correct. About 1 minute of mix time. You can already see that kind of change in colors there. And we're going to mix that nice and thoroughly. Now you want to agitate it. You don't want to agitate it too hard, especially if you're trying to get a clear base. It can create a lot of bubbles in there, but you want a good mix also. So there's kind of a fine line. Now another aspect of a quality repair job or epoxy job, or getting wood material to stick to wood, is going to be to prime the material first. want to get a little bit of epoxy on there and let it be soaking into the grain of the wood prior to wetting out the material. Now the PLY is easy to use, easy to work with. It's fairly inexpensive, and honestly, I haven't used it much in the past. It wasn't something that I really saw a need for, but I can see a need for it now, and I can also see in the DIY world, which most of you folks out there, you know, are not professional fiberglass repair folks, you know, and I can see that wanting to minimize sanding would be a cool thing. Now, you can see the material, fairly lightweight stuff, but don't let that deceive you. It's surprisingly hard to cut with scissors or a razor knife. You can do it, but I've got a little sample piece over here, and if you look, even with really good scissors, it's kind of tedious there. It can be done. Now, Works, see, WORX, Works brand makes this little zip snip that's a rotary cutter, and if you've never used one of these before, that thing is the ticket. Let's see if I get a better angle there. Matter of fact, for all your fiberglass projects, that's an inexpensive little tool, especially as I'm getting a little bit older. My hands developing a little bit of arthritis there in the thumb, and sometimes working scissors when you're doing a lot of cutting, and it's cutting that material 5 times faster than scissors are. And I'll be putting a link to the stuff we're using below there, folks. That does help support the channel, so any of the products we use that you want to get in your own shop and for your own projects, if you buy them through our Amazon links, that does help support the work we're doing here on the channel. So we've got a little bit of epoxy soaking into the wood. Matter of fact, you can see that there's resin standing, and then you can see over here the wood has kind of soaked up some of that material. I'm going to move some material around and work it in. Give this just a second while we're wetting out our material. Now, one thing you can do to speed along when you're working with epoxy, especially this is the 1708, I find that epoxy resin is a little thicker than polyester and vinyl ester, and I think that's one reason a lot of boats aren't built out of it. That and it's also quite expensive, but it does take longer for it to saturate into the material. I'm gonna need a couple more, maybe 3 more pumps. I want you folks to know how much I appreciate everyone who's been watching the channel. We've got a depth of information here, everything from documenting the build of our 29 to we recently did a whole series on our hardtop build where we built a pattern and we built a mold and then built the actual part out of that mold. We even got a few fishing videos on there. Some of you folks said you would enjoy seeing what we do during the summer months. We spend a lot of time out on the water fishing in the Gulf of Mexico in our charter business. All right. Now you can certainly use a roller for this too. In my other video or when we are actually building boats, you're going to see me most of the time using a roller for applying resin to fabric, but for this smaller demonstration today, the brush works just fine. And what you're dealing with here when you got the 1708 biaxial, the 1708 is in a 45-degree pattern, and then you've got a layer of basically lightweight CSM or chop strand mat on the backside. And I routinely, when working with epoxy, will use a pan to wet this stuff out before applying it. If you don't prime the wood, and that's what a lot of people don't do, they will saturate their epoxy cloth. They don't prime the wood, and the wood will tend to draw the resin out of this fabric, and you get a real dry laminate, which is not what you want. So this is looking good. You can see it has had a minute here to soak up some material. I'm just gonna place that nice and easy there. Good deal. We'll work in a little more. Typically, it's gonna need a minute to thoroughly soak in. It's important to have the cloth saturated, but not overly saturated. Overly saturated is not a good thing. Neither is undersaturated. So you folks have also seen here on the channel, we routinely use a little, that's called a fin roller or a bubble buster, made out of nylon. Really, really good at working air out of fabrics, getting the material to lay down properly. I like to start from the center and kind of work my way out if possible. And again, if you're curious about working with other materials, I know epoxy is very popular in the DIY world, but we work with a lot of vinyl esters and polyester resins as well. There's good, better, best. They all kind of have an application. I think I'm gonna get a little more resin on there. You'll develop a feel for it too. I want you folks that are kind of new to this, there's nothing wrong with getting a little bit of this material and just experimenting. A lot of the times we do the same here in the boat shop. Matter of fact, this piece of plywood I had here and the fiberglass I had were just some trimmings that we had from another project, and quite all right to take some stuff and maybe build something small. We obviously work in the boat world, but a lot of folks are doing these cool little homemade campers or toppers. You can also weatherproof or fiberglass or epoxy like decks and patios, building wooden vessels. We've built some little wooden skiffs in the past. Probably we'll build one this winter, and these skills would apply to all of those uses. So, very good. Now I had pre-cut a piece of PLY for this project. It's going to be a little bit big and it's going to overlap just a little. I'm kind of again start in the middle, and I'm just kind of pulling the wrinkles out of there. Just a light touch. Doing a little bit of what my dad called dabbing. My father, he was a professional boat builder, and I grew up in this shop. He was a great guy. Lost him at a pretty young age though there. I wish I would have paid a little better attention sometimes when I was younger. When I was young, you think you're just gonna have folks around forever sometimes, and that's not always the case, but pretty pleased that a lot of what he showed me and taught me is stuck. Trying to pass it on to my son. All right, we're just working the wrinkles. Now, This is also an application where you can use the little bubble buster. Now sometimes when we're working with resin and rollers, they'll get a little bit tacky or sticky. In one of my previous episodes, we talked about how do we stay clean. A lot of times I'll have a 5-gallon bucket and you can kind of clean that roller just a bit. Now remember folks, fiberglass fumes and acetone especially, highly flammable. You wouldn't want to be smoking around it or any sparks or any high heat. You always want to be careful when working with it. So I'm again going to start from the middle and just very light pressure. Not very heavy at all. You can actually see a little bit of excess resin kind of moving ahead of this little roller. You don't want to push too hard. There you go. You can see that resin moving. I think that's kind of interesting. Light pressure though. You don't want to starve. The fabric. You don't want it to be oversaturated either. All right, that is how you apply PLY. Now, what we're going to do, we are going to let that set overnight. It could be more or less, but we're getting toward the end of the day, and for us, it's going to be tomorrow. But for you guys, it's just going to be 1 second. And I'm going to show you folks what it looks like here when we peel that off and what kind of surface it gives you. Okay, so about 48 hours has passed. You can do less than that, but we were just super busy here in the shop, and you can see I've already started peeling some of the PLY or release film loose from our epoxy over plywood sample. And it takes a little bit of authority there to release it, but it's actually quite satisfying. And it's weird, if you've never worked with this stuff, it doesn't look like it should work, but it leaves a very nice textured surface that is amine blush free, which if you're not familiar with it, what amine blush is, something that a lot of epoxies will produce. Not all of them, but a lot of them will. There's actually a video here on the channel talking about how to remove amine blush. Now again, to kind of as a general overview, the release fabric is going to come in a big roll. You can actually get some smaller pieces, and if you don't have one of these little rotozip tools, these things are amazingly handy for cutting PLY or release film. And I apologize about the Blue Jays in the background. Sometimes that's just part of filming there, folks. So if y'all are enjoying the videos, enjoying the channel, please feel free to share with your friends in your boating community. Like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Captain Joe here with Island Marine Charters Fish Bump TV. My son is my amazing cameraman, and we will catch you folks next time out.